Hi, Ted Morrissey here, and I'm doing a video in connection with the 17th International Conference on the Short Story in English, titled How It Works, the Uniqueness of the Short Story, which I attended in Killarney, Ireland a couple of weeks ago. I meant to do a video before now, but I managed to bring home COVID as a souvenir from Ireland, so that laid me low for a couple days. But I want to talk about some of my experiences and my findings at the conference. It's a great conference. It's focused on the short story written in English, and it's every 2 years. I actually attended for the first time 2 years ago in Singapore, and it's a conference that's international, as it says, and they draw from basically every continent practically, and there's a lot of countries represented from Asia and Australia, as well, of course, as Europe and the U.S. and Canada and so on. And so you meet a lot of really interesting writers and scholars from everywhere, and it's always really fascinating. Now, I did a couple of things at the conference, a couple of presentations. Being both a creative writer and an academic, I did a reading. I decided to read an excerpt from my ongoing, never-ending translation of the Old English poem Beowulf. For one thing, it's just a lot of fun to read. But also, I thought it was apropos for the conference since it was in Killarney, Ireland, because a lot of scholars think that some Irish folk tales and Celtic legends, etc., contributed to the composition of Beowulf. Also, I read an excerpt from the portion that appears in my book, Delta of Cassiopeia, Collected Stories and Sonnets, which came out in 2023. And as you may know, Delta of Cassiopeia is a phrase I borrowed from Joyce, and specifically one he uses in Ulysses, actually uses it 3 times in Ulysses. And so I thought the Joycean connection made it apropos as well. But I enjoyed reading my Beowulf excerpt. It's a lot of fun to read out loud. Just has a lot of alliteration and a lot of wild things happening, beheadings and monster attacks and all that stuff. And then I also did a academic, although not very seriously academic, but an academic presentation on our podcast, A Lesson Before Writing, the podcast I co-host with Brady Harrison and Grant Tracy. And I particularly focused on the fact that in our podcast, which is a monthly happening, we always focus on a recently published short story. We have a featured short story writer each month. It isn't the only thing we talk about. It's about an 80-minute podcast, and we cover all kinds of things related to writing and editing and publishing and the teaching of writing, from hint flash fiction to epic novels and everything in between. But we do carve out each episode about 30 minutes or so to talk about whatever our featured story is. And so, as a consequence, we're keeping a pretty good pulse on what's happening in contemporary fiction, especially as it's being published in literary journals. Most of the journals that we deal with are published in the U.S., but not necessarily. We have featured stories published in UK journals, published in English language journals, but published in Berlin, Germany, etc. And so through our podcast, I feel like we keep a pretty good handle on contemporary fiction, not to mention the fact I published 12 Winters Press, and as part of that, 12 Winters Journal and the podcast. And so I'm publishing new books every year, and then 12 Winters Journal publishes new short stories, creative nonfiction, narrative poetry, mainly short stories though, that we get from everywhere. So again, because of the featured stories in the podcast, 12 Winters Press, 12 Winters Journal, and the fact I teach creative writing for 2 different universities, again, I feel like I have a pretty good handle on contemporary fiction, kind of what's going on, what trends are out there, and so on. I want to get back to that. But meanwhile, I'll just mention some of my other takeaways from the conference. Again, very, very interesting. It always is. one of the plenary panels was focused on the legacy of the Canadian author Alice Munro. And apparently, the committee decided they were going to do kind of the legacy of Alice Munro panel a couple of years ago before the scandal broke about Alice Munro. And I don't want to get into all of the details here. In fact, I don't even know all the details. But basically, Alice Munro's daughter, adult daughter, came out with the fact that her stepfather, Alice Munro's husband, had abused her sexually for years, and that her mom, Alice Munro, knew about it but turned a blind eye to it, and in fact stayed with her husband, the abuser, all these years, etc. So that's raised quite a bit of a ruckus, so to speak, in literary circles and a lot of circles. And of course, it brings up the issue of, do we separate a writer, an artist, in their work from their personal life? So can we still appreciate Woody Allen's films, even though we know Woody Allen as a person, some of the things that he did, Harvey Weinstein, his pictures versus his sexual predatory nature, and on and on and on, right? There's just a lot of examples, way too many examples. And so anyway, there was a panel, and at first I guess they were going to cancel the panel. They weren't going to have the panel once that news broke. But then they decided, yes, they would have the panel, but that would obviously become kind of a centerpiece of what they talked about. There were a lot of, half a dozen or more speakers on this panel. And then there was some Q&A afterward. And opinions were kind of all over the map. There were some people who felt like, yes, we should stop teaching Alice Munro. Her books should be taken off of library shelves and out of bookstores, and basically kind of erase her from Canadian literary history or whatever. Obviously an extreme stance. And then there were others who said no, even though what she did was hard to accept, and it's a complicated, complex situation that she was involved in, but we need to separate all that, whatever we think of that, from her actual writing, and still appreciate her as an author and especially as a writer of short stories, and then everything in between, right? So no definitive answers, and there were none expected, I don't think. So anyway, that was, I think, on the first day of the conference, and then went to a lot of really interesting panels, and I kind of divide my time between academic panels, with scholars talking about either different writers or different, eras of literature, etc. And then the creative panels, which have, folks who are writing, fiction, etc., and sharing their work and so on. I don't know if this was the first conference that did this, maybe going back to Singapore, but apparently it used to be for a number of years that writers could only read fiction, short fiction, maybe excerpts from novels, that kind of thing. But at some point recently, and maybe this conference, like I said, or maybe going back to the previous one, the conference committee decided to open it up a little bit, and creative nonfiction could also be, shared at the conference and so forth, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. The only thing is that sometimes writers are clear that they're reading fiction, sometimes they're clear that they're reading nonfiction, and sometimes they're not. And so I think there are some different ways of appreciating and contextualizing writing if it's fiction versus if it's creative nonfiction. And so I would like to know kind of what I'm hearing in order to, not that I'm judgmental, need to pass judgment on everything, but in terms of just kind of understanding what I'm hearing and my appreciating it aesthetically, I want to know what it is, and sometimes you don't. And then similarly, the conference produced an anthology of the various writers who participated. I think there's some 90 authors, including yours truly in here. And again, the title of the anthology, which is available online, is the same as the theme of the conference, How It Works, the Uniqueness of the Short Story, edited by Maurice A. Lee, who is the conference director, and Aaron Penn. Really interesting compilation of, again, some 90 or so authors. Most of it short fiction, but some of it creative nonfiction, and again, not really labeled as such, so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what one is reading. But anyway, the conference, as I say, was interesting. One of the most, heartwarming aspects of it, there was a group there from Conway, I believe that's right. Yeah, Conway, Arkansas, and specifically Hendrix College, Hendrix, and really interesting group. There are a couple of professors there. Colleen Mayo, M-A-Y-O, was one. Sorry, I'm going to get the other name here in there if I can find. I actually read on the same creative panel with the other professor, Tyrone Jagger, and they brought a group of about 12 students from Hendrix College, and they were on a pretty ambitious project. And part of what they did while they were in Ireland was they were in Dublin, and they went on the Ulysses tour, James Joyce's Ulysses tour, where people can follow the same path, or at least if they want to, all of it, but most people probably only do a portion of it. The same path that Leopold Bloom, one of the main characters of Ulysses, follows during a 24-hour period or thereabouts in Dublin. And I've done part of the Ulysses walk previously. We were in Dublin in 2018 and followed some of that path. But anyway, they took these students to Dublin and other places in Ireland, and kind of inspired by the Ulysses walk and Leopold Bloom's walking narrative of Dublin, they had the students write walking stories, as they called them. Stories about walking somewhere and the observations one makes while going on that walk, or just about the act of walking. And then they divided the students up into two different panels, and the students read aloud their walking stories. And they limited them to basically flash pieces of 750 words or fewer, in the interest of time, because most writers, we had 20 minutes to read, but giving them all 20 minutes, all the college students 20 minutes, that would have been too much in terms of time-wise. So they each had to write a 750-word flash piece based on walking. I went to both of the creative panels where they were the focus of the event, and it's really fascinating to hear their writing, their enthusiasm for writing, the quality of their writing. I mean, all of it was very heartwarming as an instructor of writing and as someone who's worried about the future of writing because of artificial intelligence and so forth. And I actually engaged with them on several topics when we got to the Q&A portion. But one of the things I did ask one of the groups about, in particular, was the idea of artificial intelligence and being used to produce text, Chat GPT, etc. And I kind of prefaced it as saying I think that most older writers, such as myself, find the whole idea quite repugnant to use artificial intelligence to generate ideas, even to generate text, certainly for creative writing. But how do they feel as undergrads in college? Do they have are they more open-minded about using artificial intelligence to help write? And pretty much across the board, the group I talked to anyway, said absolutely not. They thought it was deplorable just as much as adults do. And so they were very opposed to the idea of using AI to assist with writing. Now, again, this is a group of students who obviously take writing seriously. They kind of came from a variety of majors, which was interesting. Most of them were English or creative writing folks, but there were other history majors, economics majors, social studies majors, ed majors, elementary ed, etc. But they all agreed that that they didn't like the idea of using artificial intelligence, especially when it came to producing text. So again, that made me feel good. I don't know if it matters. I think AI is here to stay, and it's just going to become a bigger and bigger part of the publishing world, etc. But it was good to hear, nevertheless. Right? I don't want to make this video too long, but I do want to kind of come back to my podcast presentation. And, I think it was enthusiastically received. People were very interested. I played about a 10-minute excerpt from our most recent episode 24. And specifically, I played kind of the beginning of our discussion of the featured story in that episode, which is by an Irish writer, just kind of coincidentally, named Rose Keating. And so just to kind of give folks, a flavoring of what our podcast is like, especially when it comes to talking about contemporary fiction and so forth. But when I finished my presentation, I kind of opened up the floor with the comment that, we're in this sort of paradoxical situation, especially in the U.S. I think, perhaps globally to some degree, but I think it's particularly profound in the United States, where on the one hand, we're experiencing a kind of golden age of creative writing. And what I mean by that is, I truly believe that never in human history have there been so many great writers writing great stuff all the time and having it published constantly through print journals, online journals, self-publishing, and so on. So it's a golden age. And again, part of that is all the interest in creative writing programs. Universities across the country have, very robust creative writing programs with undergraduates and graduate students and MFA programs. I teach an MFA program and I teach undergrads at another college. And so I'm, constant new crop of enthusiastic writers across the board, right? So that's fantastic. But at the same time, we're living in sort of dark ages in terms of almost none of that great writing by great writers is being read. My sense is that it just kind of all goes into a sort of black hole, never to be seen again. I had a really interesting week and a unique week in many ways while I was in Ireland or traveling between the U.S. and getting back home. During that 10, 12-day span there, I received an email from an editor with proofs of a couple of sonnets. I've been writing these Mary Shelley sonnets to Mary Shelley kind of thing. 2 of them are going to be published. That was from the Poetry Lighthouse. That editor sent proofs and a publishing contract. And then a couple days later, one of the poems was actually published at Haunter Review online. And so that was very cool. And then also I received word that my entry in the Clarissa Dalloway Prose Fiction Award competition, probably not saying that quite right, but was longlisted. No publication, but longlisted, so that was very cool. And then within a couple of days, a different journal offered publication of that same story, which is The Poet in Room 12. So that all happened with just that one story within about 48 hours. Meanwhile, a sci-fi story that I had submitted a while ago was picked up for publication by Black Sheep magazine. That's going to come out this fall. And so that all happened like within just a few days. Well, here's the thing. It's wonderful. Poems accepted, poems published, stories accepted, prizes, at least longlisted for, being announced. Yet I don't have any anticipation that any of that material is going to be read by anyone other than the editors and the contest judges who encountered it, when I submitted it, etc. Nothing that's published seems to get read by anyone. I mentioned that in our podcast, as I say, we feature a contemporary, brand new short story published recently. And I always reach out to the author to let them know, hey, we talked about your story and you in our podcast. And sometimes I don't hear from them, but almost always I do, always within a day or 2 or 3. I get an email back or some kind of social media message back. And of course, most of them are thrilled that their story was the featured story. But alongside the thrill is like surprise, almost bordering on shock, that anyone actually read it and paid attention to it, right? So we're all experiencing that. We're all experiencing this writing constantly, being published constantly. Fingers crossed for that continue to happen, but yet almost nothing is being read. So anyway, at the end of my presentation in the Q&A, I kind of pointed the finger at academics, of which I am one, of course, too. I said, I had this kind of revelation in the last few years that, no one is reading contemporary, especially literary fiction, also serious poetry, on and on. But the slice of the population that has an interest in really good writing, has quite honestly the intellectual aptitude to appreciate it and understand it, is paying no attention to it whatsoever. Almost everybody who's in that little slice, that slice of academia, they are focused on their specialization. So they're still writing about, Shakespeare, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Emily Dickinson, Hemingway, on and on and on. Now, looking back through the program, there actually were more panels focused on some pretty contemporary writers than what I initially kind of thought, because the panels I was, winding up at, almost everybody was talking about dead authors, from either the 19th century or the early parts of the 20th century. But I also made the point that, like last year, I went to the American Literature Association conference in Chicago, and it was the 35th annual conference. And I had been to an earlier one, I think maybe like the 25th annual conference. It was about 10 years ago, I think. Maybe that isn't quite right. But I said that looking at the program of the 35th, which I went to last year, and then, if I could recall exactly the program of the 25th, I think they're probably about 90% the same. Same authors being talked about again: Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, Dickinson, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, on and on and on, right? And I'll bet that if we went back and could find a program from the first annual American Literature Association conference, that the program would be practically the same also. So one would get the impression from conferences like that and from a lot of the panels at the short story conference that there hasn't been a decent short story written since about 1950. Maybe The Old Man and the Sea was the last good short story written. And that, of course, simply isn't true. There's great writers writing great stories, great novels, great everything every single day. And they're getting published. And a lot of them are getting published in online journals that are easily accessible, that anyone in the world can access. But yet, people are not reading them. I've been fortunate that some academics in India have taken an interest in some of my work, and then particularly a professor in Pakistan and some of her colleagues and her students have definitely been taking an interest in my work and have been communicating with me about that. We've recently worked together to publish online a case book based on one of my stories, Vox Humana, which just happens to appear in here also, which I sent to the editors because of the renewed interest in Vox Humana, which originally was published in 2018. But beyond that, in the U.S., no interest whatsoever in practically anything that I write. And I'm not alone, right? It's just everybody's just sending their work into a void. So anyone who's hearing this, watching this, I would encourage you to, of course, keep reading the classics, keep reading the masters, but you also can carve out time to read new, current, living authors. Either buy their books or get them through your libraries if they're available. Buy them and then donate them to your library. That's another possibility. Or read them online through online journals, or get a hold of print literary journals, etc. And keep it alive. Keep literature alive here in the U.S. and everywhere. Okay, so I'm going to stop on that soapbox kind of comment and leave it at that.